The 1967 Ghost Wings, DARPA's Urban Surveillance Blueprint. Welcome to Synapse Daily. I am your host. Today, we aren't just discussing history, we are dissecting a haunting. We are looking at a document from 1967 that should not have existed. At least, not according to the public timeline of technology. While the world was obsessed with the Saturn V rockets and the space race, a much smaller, much quieter project was brewing in the hallways of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. It was the proposal for the Urban Surveillance Drone. A project designed to turn the American skyline into a permanent observation deck. Chapter 1, The Smoke of 67, A Nation at the Edge. To understand the why behind this proposal, you have to feel the heat of 1967. This wasn't the summer of love for everyone. For the Department of Defense, it was the summer of chaos. The United States was a pressure cooker. In July, Detroit erupted. For 5 days, the city was a war zone. 43 dead. Thousands injured. Over 2,000 buildings destroyed. The Army's 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were deployed not to the Mekong Delta, but to Michigan. As paratroopers moved through smoke-filled streets, they realized they were blind. In a traditional war, you have a front line. In the urban environment of 1967, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Snipers operated from the rooftops of tenement buildings. Arsonists moved through alleys unseen by police cruisers. National Guard helicopters were too loud, their downwash kicked up debris, and they were easy targets for small arms fire. The military establishment faced a terrifying realization: they could map the moon, but they couldn't see what was happening 2 blocks away in a burning city. This intelligence gap created a vacuum. In the corridors of the Pentagon, the question was asked: how do we achieve persistent oversight without a human presence? Curiosity question 1: if the military already had the U-2 spy plane, why was a tiny, low-altitude drone considered more dangerous and more necessary for the streets of Newark and Detroit? The answer was granularity. A satellite shows you a building. A drone shows you the face of the man standing in the doorway. DARPA wasn't looking for a map, they were looking for a biography of the street. Like this video. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more fascinating stories. Chapter 2, The Architecture of the Proposal. The 1967 memo was a masterpiece of cold, clinical ambition. It proposed a system of urban reconnaissance that bypassed the limitations of the human pilot. At this time, drone wasn't a household word. They called them RPVs, remotely piloted vehicles. The proposal envisioned a fleet of small, craft-like machines. They weren't the sleek, carbon fiber predators we see today. They were inspired by model airplanes but built with the precision of nuclear missiles. The technical challenge: in 1967, miniaturization was the ultimate frontier. Integrated circuits were in their infancy. DARPA's engineers had to solve a threefold problem. The power plant: how do you keep a machine in the air for 12 hours without a massive, loud engine? They looked into high-energy density fuels and even early experimentation with fuel cells. The sensor payload: high-resolution cameras in 1967 were heavy. They used film. The proposal suggested a live link using television signals, a technology used in the mid-60s for lunar probes, but never for stalking a street corner. Command and control: there was no GPS. If the drone went behind a tall building, the radio signal would drop. The proposal detailed a relay network where drones would talk to each other, creating a mesh of data, a concept we now call swarm intelligence. The architects of this plan weren't just engineers, they were social cartographers. They wanted to map the flow of human rebellion. They saw the city as a biological organism that needed to be monitored under a microscope. Chapter 3, Acoustic Camouflage and the Ghost Wings. If a drone flies over a city and everyone hears it, it isn't a spy tool, it's a target. The 1967 proposal placed a massive emphasis on acoustic camouflage. This is where the storytelling of DARPA becomes truly eerie. They studied the flight of owls. They looked at how feathers dissipate sound. The engineers proposed wide-chord propellers that turned at lower RPMs to eliminate the high-pitched whine typical of small engines.
They wanted a machine that, at 300 feet, would be quieter than the ambient noise of a city's wind.
The invisibility of sound. Imagine standing on a corner in 1967. You hear the distant sirens. You hear the chatter of the crowd. Above you, a machine is hovering. It is recording your conversation with a directional microphone. It is filming your movements with an infrared lens. And you hear nothing. Just the rustle of leaves. This was the ghost wing philosophy. The proposal suggested that the mere rumor of these drones would act as a psychological deterrent. If the public believed the air was alive with invisible eyes, the behavior of the insurgent would change. This was panopticon theory brought to life by gasoline and glass. Curiosity question 2. Was the goal of the 1967 drone to stop crime, or was it designed to ensure that no political movement could ever organize in secret again? Chapter 4. The Infrared Revolution, Seeing Through the Smoke. One of the most radical sections of the 1967 proposal involved thermal mapping. At the time, infrared technology was a military secret of the highest order. During the 67 riots, smoke from burning buildings rendered visual cameras useless. DARPA proposed equipping drones with forward-looking infrared FLIR. This would allow the drone to see heat signatures through thick black smoke. The implications: this meant the government could track people through walls of fire. They could identify someone hiding in a dark alley by the heat of their body. They could tell if a car engine was warm, meaning it had recently been driven. This was the beginning of the transparent city. The proposal argued that in the city of the future, there is no such thing as darkness. Everything radiates heat. Everything leaves a trail. DARPA's 1967 vision was to turn that heat into data. They were essentially trying to build a digital version of the God's Eye, a system that could see the intent of a crowd before a single brick was thrown. They even discussed multispectral analysis. By looking at different wavelengths of light, the drone could potentially identify the chemical composition of objects on the ground, identifying accelerants like gasoline before an arsonist could use them. In 1967, this was pure wizardry. Chapter 5: The Data Link Paradox, the Analog Livestream. To reach the scale of DARPA's ambition, we have to look at the pipe. In 1967, there was no cloud storage. There were no digital packets. If you wanted to see what a drone saw, you had to physically catch the information. This created the data link paradox. How do you transmit high-resolution imagery from a moving platform in a city full of steel obstructions without the signal collapsing? The microwave mesh. The 1967 proposal detailed a series of ground relay stations disguised as standard utility equipment. DARPA's engineers knew that the urban canyon, the space between skyscrapers, was a nightmare for radio waves. They proposed using directional microwave bursts. The drone wouldn't just broadcast in every direction, it would aim its data at specific relay points on rooftops. The processing problem: even if the signal reached the ground, the data was raw. We're talking about analog television signals with immense snow or interference. The proposal suggested a mobile command center, likely a modified van parked blocks away, filled with reel-to-reel tape recorders and early signal cleaners. They were attempting to invent real-time video stabilization using vacuum tube technology. Every frame had to be manually indexed. The sheer manpower required to watch one drone's feed was staggering. It wasn't just a machine in the sky, it was an invisible army of technicians on the ground, frantically trying to make sense of the grainy, flickering ghosts on their monitors. Chapter 6: The Domestic Espionage Act, the Legal Gray Zone. This is perhaps the most chilling part of the 1967 document. The lawyers at the Department of Defense had to figure out a way to fly these eyes over American citizens without violating the Fourth Amendment. The public airspace gambit. The proposal argued that the reasonable expectation of privacy ended where the public air began. Since the drones would fly at 300 to 500 feet, an altitude already occupied by police helicopters, DARPA argued that a drone was simply a more efficient helicopter. They were looking for a loophole. If a machine has no pilot, does it have the same legal restrictions as a manned aircraft? Curiosity question 3: If the 1967 drone didn't trespass on land, but trespassed on the visual privacy of a bedroom window, who was liable? The pilot in the van, or the agency that built the code? The memo suggested that urban reconnaissance should be classified under emergency measures.
By framing urban unrest as a low-intensity conflict, a term usually reserved for Vietnam, they sought to bypass civilian law entirely. They were treating Detroit and Newark not as cities, but as theaters of operation. This was the moment the War on Terror logic was born 3 decades before September 11.
Chapter 7: The Vietnam Connection, From the Jungle to the Streets. The 1967 proposal didn't appear out of thin air. It was a direct technology transfer from a secret program in Southeast Asia known as Operation Igloo White. In the jungles of Laos and Vietnam, the U.S. was dropping thousands of acoustic and seismic sensors to track the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These sensors looked like plants. They listened for the sound of truck engines and the vibration of footsteps. They beamed this data to a massive IBM computer center in Thailand. The urban translation: DARPA's 1967 proposal took the Igloo White concept and shrunk it for the city. They realized that if you could track a truck through a triple canopy jungle, you could track a car through a skyscraper's shadows. The drone was intended to be the mobile sensor that tied the whole system together. The engineers even discussed using chemical sniffers, sensors that could detect the scent of human sweat or combustion byproducts, gun smoke. They were bringing the brutal, high-tech counterinsurgency tactics of the Vietnam War into the American neighborhood. The city was no longer a place of residence, it was a target-rich environment for data collection. Chapter 8: Project Night Gazelle, The Phantom Trials. While much of the 1967 proposal remained on paper, there are deep-state whispers of limited field tests under the codename Night Gazelle. The midnight flights: in the late 60s, residents in certain industrial zones of Ohio and Maryland reported seeing strange, silent lights that hovered for hours. They weren't UFOs.
They were early DARPA prototypes.
Night Gazelle was the stress test for the acoustic camouflage we discussed in Chapter 3.
The drones used in these tests were reportedly launched from the back of unmarked trucks. They were tethered drones at first, connected by a thin fiber optic or copper wire to provide power and data without radio interference. Imagine a mechanical spider sitting 500 feet in the air, connected to the Earth by a literal umbilical cord of intelligence.
The failure of 1968, despite the visionary tech, Night Gazelle hit a wall. That analog lag was too great. If a drone spotted a suspicious actor, by the time the ground crew processed the film and radioed the police, the target was gone. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was too slow for the 1960s. The dream of the 1967 drone was killed not by ethics, but by the speed of the vacuum tube. Chapter 9: The Privacy Pioneers, The Forgotten Resistance.
While DARPA operated in the shadows, the late 1960s was also an era of intense civil liberties activism. A few high-ranking officials and early privacy advocates caught wind of the urban reconnaissance memos. They didn't see a safety tool, they saw the end of the American right to be left alone. The senatorial pushback: documents suggest that a small subcommittee, wary of the burgeoning surveillance industrial complex, began asking pointed questions about DARPA's domestic funding. They were concerned about the militarization of the municipal. If a drone could watch a riot, it could watch a union meeting.
If it could track a sniper, it could track a political dissident.
The resistance wasn't just political, it was philosophical. Early computer scientists, men who would later become the grandfathers of the Internet, warned that once you create a system for total observation, the system itself becomes the master.
The 1967 proposal faced a brief but intense moment of scrutiny where the question was asked: is a city still a city if every shadow is owned by the government? This friction led DARPA to pull the project back into the black budget world, moving it from a public proposal to a classified special access program. Chapter 10: The Black Budget Hibernation, 1972 to 1985.
By 1972, the urban drone as a public military project was officially declared suspended. The technology was cited as too heavy, too loud, and too expensive.
But in the world of defense contracting, suspended often means hidden.
The silent evolution: during the 1970s, the research shifted toward Project Amber and Project Condor. These were the bridge programs. While the public saw the rise of the personal computer, DARPA was perfecting the microtelemetry link. They realized that the drone didn't need to be a large aircraft, it needed to be a flying computer. During this hibernation period, the focus shifted from the airframe to the brain. DARPA began funding early artificial intelligence research specifically for pattern recognition. They didn't want a pilot to have to watch the screen for 12 hours. They wanted the drone to signal the pilot only when it saw something unusual. Curiosity question 4. If the AI was being trained in the 1970s to define what unusual behavior looked like on a city street, whose biases were being coded into the machine before most people even knew what a computer was? This was the era of the digital ghost. The hardware stayed in the hangar, but the software, the algorithms for tracking human movement, was being perfected in the dark. Chapter 11, The Silicon Valley Handover, the Dual-Use Deception. As we moved into the 1980s and 90s, the wall between DARPA and the private sector began to crumble. This is the chapter where military tech becomes consumer tech. The startup pipeline. Many of the engineers who worked on the early 1960s drone stabilization systems left the defense sector to start companies in Northern California. The high-resolution sensors designed to spot snipers in Detroit became the foundations for the digital cameras in our pockets. The microwave relay technology designed to bypass skyscrapers became the backbone of early cellular networks. DARPA knew that the fastest way to miniaturize drone tech was to let the free market do it. By allowing the private sector to develop batteries, GPS, and microprocessors for consumers, the cost of the urban surveillance drone dropped by 99%. The government didn't have to build the surveillance state, they just had to wait for us to buy it for ourselves in the form of smartphones and high-speed internet. Chapter 10, The Black Budget Hibernation, 1972 to 1985. By 1972, the urban drone as a public military project was officially declared suspended. The technology was cited as too heavy, too loud, and too expensive. But in the world of defense contracting, suspended often means hidden. While the public moved on to the Watergate scandal and the end of the Vietnam War, DARPA moved the drone project into the black budget world, moving it from a public proposal to a classified special access program. The silent evolution. During the 1970s, the research shifted toward Project Amber and Project Condor. These were the bridge programs. While the public saw the rise of the personal computer, DARPA was perfecting the microtelemetry link. They realized that the drone didn't need to be a large aircraft, it needed to be a flying computer. During this hibernation period, the focus shifted from the airframe to the brain. DARPA began funding early artificial intelligence research specifically for pattern recognition. They didn't want a pilot to have to watch a screen for 12 hours. They wanted the drone to signal the pilot only when it saw something unusual. Curiosity question 4. If the AI was being trained in the 1970s to define what unusual behavior looked like on a city street, whose biases were being coded into the machine before most people even knew what a computer was? This was the era of the digital ghost. The hardware stayed in the hangar, but the software, the algorithms for tracking human movement, was being perfected in the dark. Chapter 11, The Silicon Valley Handover, the Dual-Use Deception. As we moved into the 1980s and 90s, the wall between DARPA and the private sector began to crumble. This is the chapter where military tech becomes consumer tech. The startup pipeline. Many of the engineers who worked on the early 1960s drone stabilization systems left the defense sector to start companies in Northern California. The high-resolution sensors designed to spot snipers in Detroit became the foundations for the digital cameras in our pockets. The microwave relay technology designed to bypass skyscrapers became the backbone of early cellular networks. DARPA knew that the fastest way to miniaturize drone tech was to let the free market do it. By allowing the private sector to develop batteries, GPS, and microprocessors for consumers, the cost of the urban surveillance drone dropped by 99%. The government didn't have to build the surveillance state, they just had to wait for us to buy it for ourselves in the form of smartphones and high-speed internet. Chapter 12, Micro-Miniaturization, From Eagles to Insects. In the early 2000s, the vision of 1967 hit a massive technological catalyst, the smartphone revolution. The sensors, gyroscopes, and batteries that made the iPhone possible were exactly what the urban reconnaissance program had been waiting for since 1967. The nanodrone era. DARPA began funding MAV, micro-air vehicle, programs.
No longer were they looking at balsa wood planes with 5-foot wingspans.
They were now looking at insect-inspired drones. We saw the development of the Black Hornet, a drone so small it fits in the palm of a hand, yet capable of HD video transmission.
The 1967 proposal had worried about acoustic camouflage. By 2010, DARPA had solved it.
These micro-drones don't sound like lawnmowers, they sound like the hum of a distant refrigerator.
In an urban environment, they are practically invisible.
They can fly through open windows, perch on ledge like a pigeon, and remain stationary for hours. The Ghost Wing had finally become a literal reality.
Chapter 13: The Modern Panopticon, the AI Overlay.
Today, in 2026, the 1967 DARPA proposal isn't just a memo, it's the operating system of the modern city.
But there is one final piece that the 1960s engineers could only dream of: the AI overlay. Automated observation. In the original proposal, humans had to watch the film.
Today, the drone does its own thinking.
Modern urban surveillance drones use edge computing.
They can identify faces, track license plates, and even detect hostile intent through gait analysis, measuring how a person walks to determine if they are carrying a concealed weapon. The urban reconnaissance of 1967 has evolved into predictive policing. The drones aren't just watching what is happening, they are using historical data to predict where a crime is likely to happen and hovering there in advance.
The loop is closed. The city has become a living, breathing database. Curiosity question 5. We have achieved the 1967 vision of total urban oversight, but at what cost to the human spirit? Are we more secure, or have we simply exchanged our freedom for a high-definition cage? Chapter 13: The Modern Panopticon, the AI Overlay.
Today, in 2026, the 1967 DARPA proposal isn't just a historical curiosity, it is the fundamental operating system of the modern smart city.
But there is one final piece that the 1960s engineers could only dream of: the AI overlay.
Automated observation. In the original proposal, human analysts had to sit in dark rooms, eyes straining against the flicker of cathode ray tubes to find a single suspect. Today, the drone does its own thinking. Modern urban surveillance drones use edge computing, processing power located directly on the aircraft. They can identify faces in a crowd of thousands, track license plates across multiple jurisdictions, and even detect hostile intent through gait analysis, a terrifying technology that measures the rhythm of a person's walk to determine if they are agitated or carrying a concealed weight. The urban reconnaissance of 1967 has evolved into predictive policing. The drones aren't just watching what is happening, they are using historical data to predict where a crime is likely to happen and hovering there in advance.
The loop is closed.
The city has become a living, breathing database where every movement is a data point to be analyzed, categorized, and stored.
Curiosity question 5. We have achieved the 1967 vision of total urban oversight, but at what cost to the human spirit? Are we more secure, or have we simply exchanged our spontaneous freedom for a high-definition cage? Chapter 14: The Psychological Impact, the Chilling Effect.
One of the most profound aspects of the 1967 memo wasn't the hardware, but the intended psychological result.
DARPA understood that you don't need to arrest everyone if everyone feels like they are being watched.
This is known as the chilling effect.
The death of spontaneity. In a city under persistent drone surveillance, human behavior begins to change. We stop taking risks. We stop protesting. We stop gathering in large groups. The ghost wings we discussed in Chapter 3 create a subtle, constant pressure on the collective psyche. When the sky is no longer empty, but filled with invisible sensors, the public square becomes a controlled environment. Psychologists call this social conformity through surveillance. In 1967, the government feared the chaos of the streets. Their solution wasn't just to stop the riots, but to create an environment where the idea of a riot becomes unthinkable because the surveillance is too perfect. We are currently living through the largest psychological experiment in history, as we adapt to a world where our private movements in public space have become a permanent record. Chapter 15: Final Synapse, the Autonomous City of 2030. As we conclude this journey, we must look at where the 1967 blueprint is taking us next. We are moving beyond the drone and into the autonomous urban mesh.
The self-governing sky, the future envisioned by current DARPA projects, involves swarm intelligence. Instead of one large drone, imagine thousands of smart dust sensors and micro-quadcopters that communicate with each other like a hive of bees.
They don't need human pilots. They don't need instructions.
They are programmed with core directives to maintain order, monitor traffic, and detect anomalies.
The 1967 proposal was the seed. The modern surveillance state is the tree.
The future is a forest of sensors so dense that privacy will become an archaeological concept, something our ancestors had, but we no longer possess the vocabulary to describe. Closing thoughts: when we look back at that 1967 DARPA memo, we shouldn't see a failed project from the past.
We should see it as the most successful long-term plan in military history.
It took 60 years for the technology to catch up to the ambition, but the ambition never wavered.
The eyes in the sky are here. They are quiet. They are efficient. And they are never going away. Thank you for joining us for this epic deep dive on Synapse Daily.
We have traveled from the smoke of Detroit to the silicon of the future.
Like this video if you learned something.
The history of technology is often hidden in plain sight.
Comment your thoughts below. Does the 1967 proposal represent a triumph of security or a tragedy for liberty?
Subscribe for more fascinating stories that peel back the layers of our digital world. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon, but remember, the horizon is watching you back.